was trying to show that these had been ordinary women before and after the freedom struggles. But during that extraordinary time, they went above and beyond and out from the shadows of the lives they lived, and then just seemed to retreat back into the shadows. And why wasn't anybody remembering their story?
Nora and Sheila Wallace are my grandnaunts through my mother's side. So it's really just through my mother that I know about them, and the way she used to speak about them and how she would refer to them was really with a great deal of respect and affection.
They came from the townland of Borracoring out in Donaghmore, and it was a rural background. The family were into farming and that they were tenant farmers.
And what they did is they had oats and potatoes. They grew them continually through many years, and the soil was worn out.
They had quite a poor background. There was 10 children, and as tragically as happened in those days, a lot of them died quite young. Their father had a small farm holding, but he was actually evicted from that holding. So I think they experienced quite a poor and difficult background, which I think then went on to inform their sort of political ideas and their political persuasion later in life.
And that would have bred within the family very strong sense of social justice.
They moved into the city in around the early part of the 20th century. The 1911 census indicates that they were both in a shop in Brunswick Street as it was then, and St. Augustine Street as it is now. We're on St. Augustine Street in the centre of the city, where Sheila and Nora Wallace had their shop, which acted as headquarters for the Cork No. 1 Brigade 100 years ago. We think this is the approximate location of the shop, as it has been replaced by modern buildings since then.
My father, John Wallace, he was actually brother to the sisters, Nora and Sheila. And he very much admired the works they did. And he just loved the shop. It was a religious shop, a newsagent's, sold tobacco.
But it gradually becomes much more than that. Even prior to the 1916 Rising, and then even well prior to the War of Independence, it's a shop that was noted for its love of the Irish language, where you could get Irish language magazines that were beginning to be published. It was a shop that held pamphlets for the trade union movement and for Connolly and Larkin, because both Sheila and Nora actually had a huge sense of labour and the Irish labour movement and trade union politics. And they were both members of the citizen army, that they see the phrase, the cause of Ireland is the cause of labour, the cause of labour is the cause of Ireland. They buy into that Connolly message big time.
Yeah, they seem to become more and more involved in the sort of the nationalist movements and the sort of labour movement. So they became friendly with national figures like James Connolly. They also knew Countess Markievicz, with whom they had quite a lot of dealings with later during the War of Independence. So they seem to move in those sort of nationalist circles.
And again, their shop, they become a meeting place for those that were in Conradh na Gaeilge, those that were in the trade union movement, and those that were in the burgeoning volunteer movement. From 1912, 1913, the Irish volunteer movement, which was being established as a support to Home Rule initially, starts gathering momentum. Great numbers join all over Ireland, and there's a great group here in Cork. And some of the key members are Tomás McCurtain and Terence McSweeney.
One person who was very close to all of them was Terence McSweeney, better known as Terry. They always said he was tall, and he had a glance of flashing brightness.
Well, I think because of the sort of the people that they were with, that they were friendly with, and who shared their same sort of ideals, they were kind of identified as being people who were very much committed to the idea of nationalist separatism. And so the shop became a kind of a place where people went to discuss political topics, and they also were able to get publications that were of a political nature that were difficult to get elsewhere.
Now, when the First World War breaks out in 1914, a number of the Cork volunteers decide they are not going to back the call to go to war and back the war that Redmond asks them to do. And they split, and they reform themselves as the Irish Volunteer Force and the Irish Volunteer Movement. And that's where the Wallace sisters really then come into that movement for independence. And they strike up a very strong friendship with Thomas McCurtain and Terence McSweeney and all that inner core, like Tig Barry and others, who were going to be operating in the city as the next few years develop with the independence struggle. But the friendships are established in that period. And they come in and out of the shop, and they have a chat.
And of course, the funny stories told, boasting of his stewardship, that this evening he just went into the shop and Nora was upstairs doing something, and he decided to take, he sat behind the counter, and when Nora came down, he was there at the counter. But he said that was his merriment and his good humour. He said, I sold to the Examiner. I sold a packet of Woodbines and a packet of Sweet Aftons. Now you see my stewardship.
Basically, it's like-minded people who are making plans for where is Ireland's destiny going. And then, of course, you have the attempt at revolution in 1916 and the failure at that in terms of the initial military rebellion, but out of it grows the next move for freedom through the War of Independence.
The headquarters of the IRA in Cork, which was on Shear Street, was closed down. So the leadership had to figure out a way of how they would conduct meetings, how they could have a place to act as a de facto headquarters but not be so obvious as the previous headquarters. So the shop was identified as a good location, number one, but more importantly, Nora and Sheila Wallace, who ran the shop, their personalities and their beliefs made the shop a very appropriate place for them to do the type of activities they needed.
It becomes, amazingly, for two, country girls, quiet but well able to hold their own, those two women then become the centre of the intelligence unit of the Cork No. 1 Brigade in the War of Independence.
So they conducted meetings in the kitchen. Dispatches would have gone through the shop, so for messages that needed to go out to the battalions were routed through the shop. Messages, Crown Forces messages, were decoded in the shop. Arms were stored in the shop, and operations were also planned in the shop. So it was a single point where the leadership could spread the messages that they needed to get to the operatives. And also Nora and Sheila were also engaged in recruiting spies for the IRA, which was hugely effective from the intelligence point of view. And this was all conducted in the shop.
Now, it was Nora who was particularly involved in that. It was she who set up the depositories around the city and would have been running the gauntlet, really, in all sorts of weather, of depositing information, gathering information, and running the gauntlet of being caught with material on her. And if that was the case, then the game was up. Sheila she kept all the ledgers of monies in, monies out, guns in, guns out. She knew where all the armaments were for the different brigades, where they could be got at, all of that. And again, when you think of the information that she had on her person, if she had been interrogated at any length, how that could have, the game would have been up really for quite a few in the city. Sheila was the slighter in the stature and that, but again, she actually was regarded by the IRA as one of their top officers. She was actually inducted into the IRA, the Cork IRA, as a fully fledged officer. The shop continued on as a front, outwardly, tobacconists and that. In behind was a kitchenette, and over it was a little flat where they did have a lodger, and the lodger was brought into the whole charade, if you like, of normality, that if the shop was raided, the lodger would come down, pretend to be eating his dinner, and these were his friends round the table, and they were just having a chat and all this sort of stuff.
The shop was ideally situated in the centre of the city. It did have 2 entrances, so for those who needed a quick getaway, they could go out the side entrance. Obviously, they worked very closely with Tomás McCurtain, and in fact, Nora pretty much was his personal assistant. And so he frequently called into the shop, obviously being at the time being the commander of the Cork No. 1 Brigade. He had a very busy schedule outside his Lord Mayoral duties, as it were, as well. And the night before he was murdered by the Crown Forces, he called into the shop to do some administrative work. And Nora talks of a kind of a nice little vignette where he spotted her doing some knitting, and he asked her, was it for one of his boys, one of the active members? And of course she would have said no. It was his belief that they shouldn't be distracted from their work at the time. But sadly later, when he went home, his house was attacked and he was murdered in front of his family.
Of course, later in the early hours of that morning, they were to learn of his murder. That, I think, absolutely floored them, and it must have not rocked them to the core as it did his comrades, particularly Terence MacSweeney. They all realise now that the fight was taken to a new level when the Lord Mayor was taken out.
I don't think we can ever really appreciate the level of pressure they were on a daily basis during the height of the War of Independence. They had to keep vigil essentially 24 hours during the very height of it, because there were activities going on, dispatches being needed to be delivered. And I think their nerves, you would imagine, would have been very much frayed. But I think they were so successful in what they did because their characters were able to handle that type of pressure.
There's some lovely memories that the brigade guys had of the truce time when they sat around the table in the Wallace sisters' kitchen, and this time without looking over their shoulder. This time they could sit with the two sisters, reminisce and plan for the Ireland that was going to come from the negotiations that were going on. Little did they realise that even around that table they would split, men that they had, fed and looked after and cared for, and that were all comrades around their table, that within a few short months they would be fighting each other. That must have been an other deeply felt trauma on their part.
Yeah, Sheila and Nora were very much on the anti-treaty side. And of course this brought a great deal of anguish, I think, because former comrades who had experienced such terrible struggles together now were fighting against each other. So that no doubt took a great toll on them as well. They became quite close to De Valera, who was in later years a frequent visitor to their house.
I think the strain of the Civil War really took its toll on them then. They were under a lot of pressure and tension during the War of Independence, and a lot of activities from their kitchen did result in deaths and things like that. But the Civil War, I think it took its toll on their health, particularly Nora. Nora developed TB and was very weakened by it, and she would have been physically the stronger of the two sisters.
After the Civil War, when the fledgling state was getting up and running, and there was pensions available to people who had given service or given active service during the War of Independence, Nora and Sheila, because they were women, had to fight a great deal harder than their comparative male comrades, because the assumption was that women didn't take that sort of active role. they very much was seen as taking a supportive role. But Nora and Sheila were at the very centrum of the activities, and they were privy to all the intelligence and the communications, which was a huge part of their role. So they were very much active, but they did have to fight for that recognition. And their commanders, who knew exactly what they did, when you read their testimonies in the military archives, you quickly appreciate how highly they thought of them and how much they deserved to be recognised as much as their male counterparts. And eventually they were, and they were awarded a rank of pension which very few women in the entire country were actually awarded.
Sheila had a terrible accident in the 40s. She was getting off a double-decker bus. It was the old ones, with the handle at the back where you swung off the thing. And she stumbled getting off it, and the bus pulled off, and she had severe injuries, hit her head and that, and she only lived for a couple of days after. And it went through the old Cork IRA like wildfire, the pain of it, that this lady who had had their backs all this time, and that was the way she died, that she didn't get the chance to live out a longer, more satisfying life. She had gone back to run the shop. They ran a normal shop from the 30s into Sheila's death, 40s, and Nora carried it on. But Sheila's funeral was something really amazing. She was buried out in St Finbar Cemetery after Mass, and the old IRA organised team relays to carry her coffin the whole way from St Peter and Paul's Church to St Finbar Cemetery. That they believed that she had carried them for long enough and it was their turn to carry her,
So we can only imagine what effect this would have had on Nora. They were obviously very close, and this must have affected her greatly.
And carrying on the shop was a badge of honour to her, really, and preserving her memory was a badge of honour to her. And they kept up the contact, but they were exceptionally close to De Valera, both of them. He visited them on a number of occasions. After Sheila's death, he continued that. He would have visited Nora. He was actively supportive of her attempts to get a house. It's in Mayfield, and the name Nora changed the name to Thig Sheila after Sheila's death. It's still called Thig Sheila.
It was De Valera used to visit here, and of course every time Dev was coming, Nora used to ring a very good painter in Dillon's Cross and say, "Would you come up and paint the house? Dev is coming."
Yeah, the shop, I think its role became a much happier place after the War of Independence and in later years, because it sold all the items related to communions and confirmations.
They dressed more children for those sacraments within the inner city, those that couldn't afford it. It was known that the Wallace sisters, that shop would help you, and that you could pay it back or whatever would be helped. Rosary beads, little prayer books made their way to children who would never have got them because the families simply couldn't have afforded them. Food parcels, a way of doing a thing quietly and with dignity, carrying out James Connolly's socialist vision in very small local ways, but Nora remained true to that till the day she pulled the shutters down on the shop. I was told a lovely little anecdote about it. It's not anything to do with politics, but it has everything to do with, I suppose, the vision of two women who wanted to brighten life for where their shop was. There were lanes, there were narrow little streetways where all of human life teemed. And some went home to better places and others didn't go home at all. They wanted to make that shop, at least the window of it, reflect some kind of joy and beauty.
At Christmas time, they decorated the front window of the shop with holly and ivy, and in the interior was sort of straw and a little bit of frost. And then she put up all the different figurines.
Because they knew that there were plenty of families who wouldn't have had any of that paraphernalia for Christmas and would at least give through their window some sense of joy in that.
Nora died in September 1970. She was in a nursing home at that stage, but she at least lived to a much more advanced age than Sheila did. Their graves are out in St. Finbarr's Cemetery. So in the family, we still have a great deal of interest in them. I still think there's a lot more to find out about them and others. So we're very proud, but it's a sort of a quiet pride. We're not unique. There are a lot of families in Cork, in Ireland, who have had connections with the War of Independence. But I suppose they're unique as women being so centrally involved in the movement is very interesting, and one which we're very, very proud of.
Mary McSweeney was actually born in Surrey in England in 1872, and she spent a couple of years there with her family. There were 7 in all, plus the mother and father. And then the family came back to Cork to settle and to work and to put down roots here.
She was the eldest of the family. But then you have to see that her father came from the McSweeneys, which were great fighters that came down from Donegal and all the way down, and he met their mother, Mary's mother, in London, where she was teaching in the Catholic school. Her name was Mary Wilkinson, and she was an enormously powerful, spiritual, holy, intellectual woman who had a huge influence on the family, and Mary was the eldest.
And in her early years then she was enrolled in school in St. Angela's College, just on Patrick's Hill here in the city, and she went through primary school there and then really blossomed in her second level education. But she had persistent health issues with polio and different things that led to some deformity in one of her feet, and she had an issue with a limp for most of her life and that. But she overcame a lot of that, and she overcame absences from school by being a very diligent student when she was there, and she was a very intelligent lady, and that kind of blossomed in her in second level.
Annie McSweeney, she was born in Cork in 1883, and she was actually born in McCurtain Street, King Street at the time, number 48. So she would have, I suppose, she was the youngest girl in the family. She would probably have gone to St. Angela's School, which is just around the corner from where she lived. And then she went on to University College Dublin, where she got her BA degree. And following that, then she went to the Isle of Wight, a place called Ventnor, which is like a seaside resort in the Isle of Wight. So she taught maths and English to mostly foreign students, because it was a finishing school, if you like. So she loved teaching. She was absolutely very good at the teaching, and she loved her students.
So Muriel was born in 1892 in Cork City, in one of the more affluent areas at the time. It would have been near Montenotte way, and she was born into a very well-to-do Catholic family, the Murphy Brewing family.
Which means we're talking about Middleton and the distillery there. But she was the youngest of that family, much younger than any of her brothers and sisters. So she was growing up in Montenotte in a very posh, big house. So these were well-off people.
They were also very well connected in Catholic circles to the higher levels of the church and that. And there would have been education in the home with governesses, things like that.
So the people that she knew when she was young mainly were maids and servants, which means they were local people. So she was actually becoming more influenced by the people that she was meeting, and then she was reacting to the, let's say, the politics of and the wealth of her family.
And she began to ask really serious questions about the tenement housing and the children on the streets, barefoot, ragged. How was that happening, and why weren't they dressed like their family? And these questions, and then questions with the church and that, began to make her family very uncomfortable. And she was a bit of an enfant terrible to the family, if you like, that what to do with Muriel. And in later life, I think she took pleasure in this sense that she was bucking the trend in the family. But in the end, they sent her to England, actually, to finishing school. She said, to make a nice good girl out of me, but they didn't succeed, she said. From there, from second level then, the family were very big into education, the McSweeney's, really very big into it, for the girls as well as the boys, which was unusual in the times. And Mary was encouraged to go further with her education, and she was sent on to England, back to England, to go through university in teacher training college attached to Cambridge University. And she qualified from Cambridge University with a diploma in teaching.
The father, he went off to Australia to try and get a bit of income, because things were really bad in Ireland and for the Irish and so on. And the mother, who was this amazing influence and very spiritual, very holy woman, she died.
So ostensibly then Mary was the mother of the family, but she was also the breadwinner because she was the oldest of them all. So she was faced with really keeping the family together, keeping a roof over their heads, and also finding work for herself. So she went back to her old alma mater, St. Angela's, and they employed her as a teacher there. I suppose Mary got involved really once she came back to Cork, because she was coming back to a Cork that was moving out, as I said, out of the loyal kind of tradition and into thinking more of nationalist questions.
This was a time that was very anti-women, and it was very difficult. And Mary was growing out of that circumstance, asserting the rights. We're children of God. We are equal.
And then by 1910, she was getting herself involved in things like the Munster Franchise League, helping, she was becoming a suffragist to look for the vote for women. She felt it was their right, not something that even needed to be fought for. It was their right, they should have it. And from there, she, like many other women like her, she was brought into the language movement. She joined the Gaelic League. She was a lifelong lover of Irish, not a fluent speaker herself, but she had great graw for the language. And then that kind of really started to politicise her, and she began to then listen to the friends that Terence was bringing home as well. As I said, there was a very close bond between them, and his involvement in the volunteers from 1912, 1913 on, she was listening, she was interested, and she was very supportive of him. And then from 1914, of course, she was looking for a parallel movement that she could join, and that was Cumann na mBan. And she was in that really from the ground up all the way. That really formed her thinking. All her skills of organisation came out. She was a very forthright woman. She was a very able woman. All of that ability in her was really coming to the fore through Cumann na mBan.
I think it was the outbreak of World War I, 1914, that Annie came back to Cork. And of course, the Cumann na mBan had been founded, and she joined Cumann na mBan like her sister, and she got involved in all the activities of Cumann na mBan.
One of the stories about Annie, she's in the top of a bus, and this is well before 1916, and she's looking out in the bus and she sees this, is it like a funeral or a demonstration or something? And there was a Donovan Rossa demonstration of some sort, a march in Cork. And she's looking at this and saying, what's this about, and so on. And she looked, and behind it were just a small number of people. But there was our brother Terry, and he had a shining light in his eyes. And she said, God, I'm seeing something in Terry I hadn't seen before.
She came back to Cork in 1914, having finished in the finishing school in England, and immersed herself in the cultural activities as would be expected of her class, if you like. She was involved in music circles, drama circles, poetry, that sort of thing. Formed a great friendship with a lady called Geraldine Sullivan Neeson, who was also, instrumental in bringing her into the Republican movement. But she was very friendly with the McSweeney family, and so they would have attended soirees together that the McSweeneys would have been at, Mary and Annie possibly, and then Terence was involved in the Celtic Literary Society, so they would have encountered him there as well.
And it was in the context of these, in this era of learning music, and that she met him. So she now is a radical, and she now is rejecting the Murphy thing and the wealth and the power and the privilege and so on. And here is Terence McSweeney, the radical, who is going to help to free Ireland of all of this, to get out from under the yoke of all this stuff and so on.
Initially, it wasn't an instant attraction from his part anyway, because of, I think, of who she was. She said that he was a bit suspicious of her background and of where she came from, and of course there was money involved in all of that. But gradually the IRA in Cork came to take to her and to realise that she was very committed and very interested, albeit very young. And gradually, I think Terence McSweeney was gradually won over, and they became initially friends. Now, it really gelled when he was caught up in the 1916 Rising.
She has a witness statement of what happened in 1916, of her involvement at the time. And the Tuesday or Wednesday before Easter Sunday and the Rising on the Monday, she was asked to go to Dublin by Tomás McCurtain. And that was to set up a meeting with Sean McDermott and Tom Clark and James Connolly with her brother Terence. He wanted to go up and meet them the following day because they were worried, I think, because there was a split in the organisation in Dublin, and they were worried in case things go wrong, which they did afterwards. But when she got to Dublin, she was met by Sean McDermott at the train, but they didn't speak to each other. They actually travelled on the same tram to Thomas Clark's house, and they didn't sit together, so they just kept apart because things were so dangerous in Dublin at the time. When she went to the house, she told them what she was asked, that her brother wanted to come up the following day, and they said no, it would be too dangerous for him. Following the Rising, when there was so much uproar in Cork, the Bishop and the Lord Mayor in Cork made an agreement with the British authorities that the volunteers, if they handed up their arms, that there would be no arrests in Cork. So that agreement was there, and then a couple of days later they found out that they were arresting people. She heard they were arresting people all over the city.
And Terence was arrested in the city now there was very little activity in the city, but they were arrested as volunteers, and the family members then were also caught up in the military swoop. Annie was questioned at home rather strongly, and Mary was arrested in St. Angela's College. In the middle of class, she was actually marched out in handcuffs.
And so she was incensed at this. She went off to find the bishop, and she went to his house. He wasn't there, so she found out where he was. She searched for him, she found him, and she more or less gave out to him, because she was saying, you organised this agreement, and here they are, and your word can't be worth anything, So I think there was a bit of steel in her to go kind of approach him and tell him more or less, do something about this, which he did. And a few days later then they were all released again. So I think those two things show you that she wasn't kind of shrinking violet. She was able to do what was needed to be done,
So again, here's the measure of these women at this time, and I always find this fascinating about them, that even though they were living in an era where they had barely got the vote, some of them, yet the core of them, like Mary McSweeney, they were very strong thinking, independent women who decided ourselves alone means more than just a movement. It applies to me as well. And herself and Annie decided to set up their own school. Now, they rented the premises originally up in Belgrave Place. It's now a hostel, but it was then named Scoil Oíche, or St. Oíche's School. And they decided, if we can't get work anywhere else, we'll start our own school. And in the early years, it was very vibrant. The Republican movement was very good to them. They sent their daughters there, and they had a boys' school up to maybe First Communion age. It was run on a wing and a prayer later, but initially funds from the Republican movement was quite good to them to get it established. They both taught there. Mary was Privida, as she used the title, principal, and Annie, her sister, was Las Privida. Annie taught English and maths. Mary taught Latin and history and religion. So, and then they branched out. Other women from the movement, like Geraldine Neeson, came to teach in the school later. So they had a very broad curriculum: languages, drama, music, cultural studies, and then the basic studies. She became a regular visitor. The friendship really strengthened there into a romance. They were engaged there. She came back home. All hell broke loose at home. They didn't want her engaged to what they saw as a gunman and a fella with no prospects and on the run and that, and in prison currently. And she was having none of it. He was the only one for her. They were committed to each other. And they told her that obviously that they weren't going to, provide funding for the wedding or anything like that. So she told them that wasn't a problem. She'd wait till she came into her own money, and she did. She came into her own money when she was 25, which was just around June of 1917. And she went over to Bromyard along with Geraldine Sullivan Neeson, and she went with the two sisters, Mary and Annie McSweeney, and a very interesting man later in life, Dick Mulcahy. That was the wedding party that went over to Bromyard Prison. They brought Terence's uniform in a bag, and he was secretly able to get dressed in it under his prison clothes. He got permission for some kind of a ceremony to take place. They allowed a chaplain in to talk to him, who turned out to be one of the Capuchin priests who married them. It was a very historic moment because this girl defies her family, the Murphy family, to marry this man. And equally, in that little wedding photograph are a united bunch of Republicans who are later to be totally split over the treaty or over family issues later. So it's a really historic moment of their friendship and also of the Republican movement at that time. He was released in around 1917, but he was sporadically imprisoned over the next few years. It was a very difficult time for them as a young couple, but they lived in a number of places. Ballingeary was one. Moira Ogue was born at that stage around 1918. They brought her down to Ballingeary, and it was Muriel went there to learn her Irish and that. He was in and out of prison, so it was a very unstable setup that way, and she had to rely on Mary and Annie quite a bit. And it's interesting actually, when Moira Ogue was born, Terence was in prison actually up in Belfast. It was Mary and Annie who supported her through the birth, and it was Annie who travelled with her soon after the birth with the baby in tow all the way to Belfast to introduce her to her father, Terence. Now in those days, men had sole legal control in that way over their children. He made it that Mary and Muriel would be co-guardians of the little baby. Some see that as very interesting. Why did he do that? I myself think he did it as a support to Muriel, who was quite young and who at that stage had kind of ostracised herself from her family, and that would be a support to her. I don't think he ever envisaged how it was to break down legally later on, and the tensions between them that emerged over it. They were absolutely shattered a few months earlier when their great friend Thomas McCurtain was murdered at home. And it brought home to them all really how dangerous an activity their politics and their militantism was, that they were going to find themselves in the forefront of any reprisals or anything that was going down in the city. And that's exactly what happened with Terence, of course. He stepped up to the plate to take on McCurtain's mantle, both as Lord Mayor but also as leader leader of the Cork No. 1 IRA brigade in the city, and that definitely put him both literally and figuratively in the firing line, and that brought his family into it as well. Now, his sisters, I think, were very protective of him, but were also very supportive, and they did worry for him. Mary did worry for him particularly, and when he was arrested, she went to the court martial. She attended every day along with Muriel and Annie, and they were very forthright in trying to make clear that this was the Lord Mayor of Cork, and that he shouldn't be treated in this way. And they followed his progress all the way, even when he was transferred from prison in Cork to England. Very unusually for women of that time, they just packed up their bags and they followed him over to London and took up residence there, and on a daily basis turned really the hunger strike into not just a lone moment for one man in an English prison where he could have literally been, held in captivity and kept out of public eye. They made sure that it was right slap bang in the centre of the media attention all the way through.
Devastating. Can you imagine being there day after day watching your brother deteriorating, and you knew he was going to die. You knew he wasn't going to give up. And yet she had the foresight to write a diary and record every day of his hunger strike.
But that diary makes for such powerful, poignant reading, and what you get across from the diary from the three women is that it definitely, from my perspective, the death of Terence and the manner in which he died shaped their own three lives later in whatever direction they took. Now, Annie McSweeney refers to her in her diary as the quiet dignity of Muriel, how it impressed them all, and how it made the prison staff look in a very bad light, that this lady, would go in day after day and would pull herself together, and yet at night would kind of collapse and fall apart. Some people see that as a weakness on Muriel's part. I see that as a very human person, as somebody who was experiencing one of the greatest traumas that anybody can go through, the gradual dying of a loved one. A deeply loved one is what I would say. And did it unnerve her? She would have wanted to be stone if it didn't. Did it traumatise her? Same answer, absolutely. Did it leave her broken? Yes. Did it leave her health and her mental state affected? Yes, it did. But it affected others around him as well. And she needed, to take time out. And what was she asked to do? Go to America and take on a lecture tour.
And so when her brother died, and Terence McSweeney died on hunger strike, she took up the position as a leader carrying on his mission and his vision. And she and Muriel were asked to go to America to continue the campaign which Terence McSweeney had launched, which was to shame the British throughout the world so as to help get rid of the empire. De
Valera in particular was very anxious that Irish America would be brought into the picture, and that the death of Terence McSweeney would not be allowed rest there in the grave, if you like, that it would be used as a powerful mobilising tool on the American side of the issues, because the deaths of the two Lord Mayors, then it was followed by the burning of Cork in December of 1920. This went viral all over the world, viral in those terms, or in those days. And it led to the setting up of a very powerful American commission, which had a cross-section of American politicians from both parties, but also from American society. In among them was William Randolph Hearst, who was, as you know, a top media mogul really at the time. And he was very influential in publicising what went on at the meetings of the commission, and in particular with Muriel and Mary publicising, and Donal O'Callaghan, the Lord Mayor of Cork, their contributions. And they made headlines all across America in the mainstream newspapers.
And following his death and the funeral and all that devastating time for all the family, she had to come back and run the school, because Mary and Muriel went off to America, and they would have the constellation of, travelling to America, meeting people, organising different events in America, whereas she had to go back to the day-to-day running of the school. And she kept that going, and I think, at the end of the day, the school closes at a certain time and you're there on your own, and you're thinking of what happened. So it must have been very hard on her, I think,
Annie McSweeney carried a lock of his hair. She cut it from him, carried it in a locket all her life till she died. Moira Oak found it on her when she died.
But Mary's speeches in America were incredible. I think she had the Guinness Book of Records for the longest speech ever in an American house of any kind of representatives. So it would be like a state assembly. So she did that all over America, and furthermore, she was really good at it. But the Daughters of the Revolution, these were the upper class American ladies who also could trace their ancestry back to the first ship that went over and so on. And they deemed it appropriate to allow her to speak to them. And so she thanked them very much, and she made her little speech, and then she said, and they said, thank you very much, Miss McSweeney, but we're a little bit uncomfortable about, and she said, well, you're uncomfortable. I appreciate you're uncomfortable. I think what it is that you like our aims, yes, but you don't like our methods. Oh, that's it, Miss McSweeney. We don't like your methods. Oh, you mean things like ambushes? She said, yes, exactly. We don't like ambushes. Can I describe an ambush to you? She said, oh, yes, please. Okay. So you have the British soldiers, they're coming along, and they've got their flags and so on, and they're marching in rows of two, and it's very nice, and they're coming to this little bridge. But the other side, they're actually hiding behind the bridge, and they're hiding behind trees, and they're in a low little dips and so on. And then as the British soldiers come over the bridge, these other people start shooting at them. He said, is that what you... Yes, Miss McSweeney, we're not comfortable with that. And she said, I've just described to you the Battle of Concord Bridge, which was the start of the American War of Independence. So she had a way of getting to them, and that would be a classic for her.
The general election was held around May of 1921, and Terence's seat, of course, was vacant, and she was put forward as a candidate for Sinn Féin in Cork, and she was elected in her absence. No, so was Donna Logue. They were elected in their absence, but it was really her first taste of mainstream politics. But she knew she could cut it because she had done it in America, and I think it gave her a new lease of life. Now, Muriel herself finishes the trip in America, stays very limited time in Ireland, and goes on to Germany in Wiesbaden. And this is by herself to recover, and she checks into a centre there to, I suppose some would call it a sanatorium, to regain her mental and physical strength. And she just needed, I think, away from Ireland to catch her breath, because Ireland then was drifting into the treaty, and she actually sends in December a letter back to the Dáil saying how she can't believe this is happening, and that if Terry had been alive, he would have voted against it too. She had wanted to go to London to be on the negotiating team for the treaty. She appealed to Dev. They were very close at that time. And
people like Collins and Griffith said, oh, no, we don't want her. And Dev was saying, I think she's just a bit argumentative, so maybe we'll leave her out. But in retrospect, they needed somebody strong to actually stand up to the bullying that happens then, which they didn't have.
So she voted against the treaty. as did all the women, and along with De Valera they walked out of the Dáil when the vote went against them then. And there was a bit of a hiatus for a number of months, and then really the splits begin to appear on a military level, and the Civil War begins. Incidents begin to happen, and the Civil War then, as such as we know it, begins to really take place then.
Formally, the British authorities had no idea of how involved the women were, so they didn't take any notice of what was going on. But then when things changed, the people in government knew what the women could do, so I think it was then that all the women were arrested. It wasn't the British authorities who were arresting the women. It was the Free State, as they called it at the time. Mary was arrested, and she was imprisoned in Mountjoy, and she went on hunger strike there. So Annie went to visit her, but they wouldn't let her in. She tried several times to get in, and they wouldn't let her in. So she went on hunger strike outside the prison, and of course she got great support outside.
Well, they were very much a partnership. They were very much a team, you know. So if Mary was inside in the jail and she and the other women were being treated very badly, I mean, everything except the worst, basically. And so it needed support outside. And so Annie was the leader outside. And if necessary, a supporting hunger strike outside, then she would do it. You know, she was as determined as any of them and as strong as any of them.
And her sister-in-law Muriel was in America at the time of one of the hunger strikes. She marched with Irish Americans with a big placard.
I know Mary's hunger strike lasted 24 days, but I think Annie would have been probably 11 days before Mary was left out. And of course then again in the following February that Annie was arrested.
The hunger strikes weakened physically Mary when she came out of prison, as with the other hunger strikers. They suffered later in life from stomach problems and kidney problems that was to have a lasting effect, and it did impact on her health in later life. Now, she comes back to Ireland again, and it's in 1922-23, it's the Civil War, and she takes part in that Civil War. She initially takes part in the fighting in Barry's Hotel, in the Gresham Hotel. She's holed up with Cathal Brugha and a number of others, Linda Kearns, Kathy Barry, and they run the gauntlet of the pro-treaty forces there. And of course, Cathal Brugha is fatally shot and he later dies. That devastates her because they are so close as friends. And he was a very kind person in her life after the death of McSweeney. After the, I say 23, she was burnt out really from the Civil War and distraught after it. She went off to Germany then, and this time she takes Máire Óg with her. And Máire Óg is about 5, and they really haven't had much time together for say 2.5 to 3 years, which is a big chunk of life in a child's life. So it's attempting to build a relationship which is very sticky, and it remains sticky, certainly from the child's perspective, for most of her formative years, I'd have to say that now. And if you read Máire Óg's book, you get that sense. From the age of 5 till about 12, she is in a whole series of boarding schools in Germany and Austria. And that means she is for long periods of time away from the only parents she knew, and away from the friends and the grandparents that had looked after her in Ireland.
Well, Annie kept the school going. I mean, they obviously had a fantastic staff in the school because both of them were missing as long periods over the years, and the school kept going. So Annie kept the school going.
Mary, I think, remained political right through the 30s, but it was becoming a very disillusioned road for her because she lost her Dáil seat in 1927. Once, I suppose, William Cosgrave was taking over Cumann Gael and the establishment really of the Free State, people in Cork were becoming less and less open to the anti-treaty version of the Republican movement, and Mary was beginning to find herself a little bit like yesterday's woman, if you like.
And she was raging at the fact that De Valera walked out of the Dáil and said he couldn't accept the treaty, and then 5 years later he walked back in and the same treaty was there, you know, so he couldn't accept it one time, then he accepted it again. So they were totally anti-Dev, and totally, they just felt that the government that was there, it wasn't the Republic.
So she began to associate with the political parties, the communist parties in Germany, and she joined circles of them there. She was very active with them, and I think that's where she definitively finished with the Catholic Church as well, and that she was taking herself down a very definite route politically and a very definite route socially. And I think that's why also she brought Moira Oak with her to Germany. From my perspective, that I think she did that to keep Moira Oak from what she viewed as a Catholic-dominated Ireland. Mary and Annie had their supporters, very strong support in Ireland. They had concerns over the way the child was being educated in Germany. They had concerns particularly over the fact that she was in boarding school. And I think they were lonesome for her as well. But there was also an issue, and Muriel refers to this herself, and I don't think in Muriel's favour that it's ever given enough credence, and the fact that these schools were not Catholic and that they were not, in their eyes, religious, that affected their thinking about Moira Oak's upbringing as well. And they had support from the IRA on the continent, and Mary had secured a passport for her through her connections with De Valera and that. This was around 1932, and they came back to Ireland. She was, the child made her way to a village where Mary was staying. She was smuggled, some would say kidnapped. Moira Oak said she was just smuggled out of Germany with her papers and brought back to Cork. Now, a court case did follow. Muriel, as we can well imagine, was distraught about this, and a court case followed immediately after, and that was held in Dublin. Now, Muriel, to her dying day, believed firmly that the forces of the establishment were against her, that it was a lost cause. It's one of those awful family tragedies that, you know, is very, very real to lots of us, you know, that we can understand both sides. I think the saddest part about it all was that mother and daughter never reconciled, despite great efforts on the daughter's side.
She was a very strong woman, Muriel, and she said to my mother that if you leave, and she tried to get her to come back to Germany with her, and my mother said she didn't want to, and her mother said, "Oh, I won't talk to you ever again." But that extended that she wouldn't talk to me either. So I never talked to her. I miss that.
She resigned from Cumann na mBan in the 30s. She similarly resigned from Sinn Féin. In terms of her later life, I think the joy of her life was Moira Oak, her niece. In particular, Moira Oak was heartbroken when Mary's health began to fail. And it was, you know, the life that she had led began to catch up with her, the stress and the strain, the hunger striking. And she died in 1942. She was just in her 70th year from a heart attack.
She was left on her own, you know, to run the school. And now they had great teachers and they had great support.
And I think things were starting to go downhill a little bit because they were accepting students without fees because they felt they couldn't afford it. So in 1954, her health deteriorated and they decided to close the school. But they didn't just close the school, if you like. The students that were there, they made sure that they had somewhere to go. They made sure that they were all looked after. And it was later that year, then October 1954, when Annie got a heart attack and died. She's buried in St. Joseph's Cemetery with Mary and Sean and her mother.
In terms of the life that she lived later, very able, highly intelligent woman who got herself interested, as I say, in political issues, particularly with the Communist Party in Germany, and then again with France, and then with Britain, with the British Communist Party, because it had very close links with the Irish Communist Party. So she kind of made links back there. She became close to Michael O'Riordan and later his son Manus in the Irish Communist Party.
And she came to visit both him and my mum, Kate Cahan O'Riordan, who was also a member of the Communist Party. And I remember her coming into our sitting room and we all sitting down, and she was dressed in black. And obviously at that stage, she would have been about 70. And to me, obviously, she appeared like an old lady, but very nice. Muriel was showed great empathy, because Manus wanted to ask her some things and she was absolutely delighted. So that first letter, one very nice thing she referred to was, she said she didn't like her name Muriel, and that Terence McSweeney, her husband, had told her that in Gaelic it was Muir Gial, bright sea. And she was very touched by that, and in fact she signed all her letters, her 3 letters, as Muirgal Ban Vic Hivna.
And the other person was Hannah Sheehy Skeffington's granddaughter.
I only have very vague memories of Muriel. I would have been about 7 or 8 when I met her, and she would have been trying to meet with my father. My father, Owen Sheehy Skeffington, was a senator, and I don't know whether that was connected, but she wanted to meet with him and have him help her with whatever difficulty. She seemed kind of troubled or in difficulty. As I say, I didn't know much more, except that later I'm assuming that it was to do with her daughter. So what's odd is that she would send me books for Christmas. But on the inside, and I think this is the thing, obviously, that is the memory, it's dedicated, and I'll just explain it before I show it to you, because it's dedicated to me in French, à ma chère Micheline de sa vieille amie, to my dear Micheline from her old friend. And then she writes in Irish, the old Irish script, "Oh, Muriel Van Vic Sivna." And then in brackets, she puts Madame Terence McSweeney. So, and on top of that, my mother's writing just says in French, a Christmas present from Muriel McSweeney to Micheline, the 28th of December, 1960.
Her interest in Irish affairs continued enormously, but it spread, to world affairs. So she developed a relationship with a French hero who was fighting against Germany, against the Nazis in Germany.
And that was a man called Pierre Kahn, and that became a very strong relationship with her. And they did have a daughter together, Alex.
Coincidentally, he also, like Terence McSweeney, had a journal, had a newspaper. He was a writer, he was a poet. So she had an affinity with him.
She never lost her interest in things in Ireland, particularly the Northern Ireland question from 1969 onwards. But later in life, she never lost that social awareness, sense of social justice. And she had huge issues with the housing crisis. In the 70s in Dublin, she flagged issues up that were going to become issues for the Irish state later in the 1990s and 2000s as investigative journalism, grappled with those questions. She died in 1982 in October, very close to Terence's own death. She died on October the 26th, 1982. She's buried in Tunbridge Wells in a cemetery in Kent there. But I think it's high time that she was recognised as part of Irish history's story, as more than just Terence MacSweeney's widow. She was a very complex woman. She was a revolutionary in her own right. She was flawed, yes, what human being isn't, but she had passion and she had foresight and she had intellect that she was never given credit for.
I think over the years we've heard of all Terence MacSweeney, Padraig Pearse, we've heard of all the men and what they did for Ireland. And they wouldn't have been able to do it without the women.
They deserve to be part of that story, to be remembered and also to be looked at and studied, you know. And these 5 women, Mary, Annie and Muriel MacSweeney, and then Nora and Sheila Wallace, like they stepped out of the shadows really of the lives that they were leading, and I mean that in the best sense of that word, of ordinary, and were presented with extraordinary circumstances both in family setup and in the surrounding areas of history that was developing in front of them. And they took their place in that. They stepped up and got involved in extraordinary events and did extraordinary things themselves, and then seemed to, you know, disappear into the mists of time. And there's a lovely piece written by Lil Conlon, who was a member of the Shandon branch of Cumann na mBan right up to 1924-25. And in the 1960s, she put together a book that was really a pioneering effort in documenting what the women in Ireland did as part of their membership of Cumann na mBan. And she says, they were the heroines of history, unsung, unrecorded, but nonetheless fulfilling a glorious destiny. And to all our Irish women, and particularly to Mary, Annie, Muriel MacSweeney, and to Sheila and Nora Wallace, it can be said, I have fought the good fight. I have run the race. I have kept the faith.